The whispers started the moment Margaret Daniels stepped into Ordway's general store. At 22, she'd grown accustomed to the sideways glances and hushed comments about her size. But today, the whispers stung more than usual as she fingered the bolt of cream-colored fabric she'd been eyeing for weeks. What's the use of buying that? It's not like she'll ever have a wedding dress, a woman's voice carried from behind the dry goods shelf. Hush, Beatrice, came the reply, though not quiet enough. The poor girl can't help being built like a carriage horse. Margaret's fingers froze on the fabric. The year was 1878, and in Ordway, Colorado, a woman's prospects were measured as much by her figure as by her character. At her size, Margaret had long ago resigned herself to spinsterhood, despite her youth and the warm heart that beat beneath her ample bosom. "Miss Daniels," Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, cleared his throat. "Will you be purchasing that fabric today?" Margaret withdrew her hand as if burned. "No, thank you. I just remembered I'm needed at home." She hurried out, bell jingling over the door as she escaped into the crisp autumn air. Ordway wasn't a large town, but it felt suffocating on days like this. The dusty main street stretched before her, lined with false-fronted buildings that housed the bank, the saloon, the small hotel, and various shops that served the ranchers and farmers of the surrounding area. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, ducking her head as she passed two women who abruptly stopped talking at her approach. She quickened her pace, eager to reach the sanctuary of her father's bakery at the far end of the street. "Whoa there, Miss Daniels. You're moving faster than a spooked heifer." The deep voice stopped her in her tracks. Margaret looked up to find herself face to face with Matthew Keller, his tall frame blocking the afternoon sun. The rancher's son tipped his hat, revealing a shock of wheat-colored hair and eyes that reminded her of the Colorado sky in summer. "Mr. Keller," she managed, her face flushing. "I didn't see you." "I reckon not, with your eyes fixed on your boots like that." His smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Everything all right, of course," she lied. "Just in a hurry to help my father with the afternoon baking." Matthew nodded, though his eyes held a hint of doubt. "Well, don't let me keep you. Though I'll be by later for one of those apple pastries your father makes, best in the territory." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "I'll tell him to save you one." As she turned to go, Matthew called after her. "Miss Daniels, that new blue dress you wore to Sunday service last week, it suits you. Brings out your eyes something fierce." Before she could formulate a response, he tipped his hat again and continued on his way, leaving Margaret flustered and confused. Matthew Keller had never paid her any particular attention before, and compliments from handsome cowboys were rare commodities in her life. She shook her head and resumed her walk to the bakery. It was foolish to read anything into a simple compliment, she told herself. Men like Matthew Keller, tall, handsome, and heir to one of the largest cattle spreads in the county, didn't court women like Margaret Daniels. The warm, yeasty smell of her father's bakery enveloped her as she pushed open the door. Inside, James Daniels was sliding a tray of bread into the large brick oven. "There you are, Maggie," he said, wiping flour-covered hands on his apron. "I was beginning to worry." "I'm sorry, Pa, I got delayed at the general store." Her father's keen eyes studied her face. "Something happened?" Margaret busied herself with putting on her own apron. "Nothing worth mentioning. What needs doing?" Her father let the matter drop, but his concerned gaze followed her as she moved about the bakery. "The widow Johnson ordered a birthday cake for her grandson. Could you start on that? And we need another batch of dinner rolls for the hotel." Work was the perfect distraction from her troubled thoughts. Margaret lost herself in measuring, mixing, and kneading, finding solace in the familiar routine. By late afternoon, the bakery was filled with the mouth-watering aroma of fresh bread and pastries. The bell over the door jingled, and Margaret looked up from decorating the birthday cake to see Matthew Keller ducking through the entrance. The sight of him sent an unwelcome flutter through her stomach. "Afternoon, Mr. Daniels," Matthew greeted her father, removing his hat. "Miss Daniels." "Young Keller," James Daniels beamed. "What brings you to town today?" Ranch business mostly, but I couldn't leave without stopping by for one of your famous pastries. His eyes drifted to Margaret, then quickly back to her father. And to ask a favor, if I might. James raised his eyebrows. A favor? Yes, sir. The hands and I have been working dawn to dusk with the fall roundup, and we're all getting mighty tired of Cookie's biscuits. I was wondering if you might consider sending out some fresh bread and pastries to the ranch tomorrow. We'd pay well for the trouble. I'd be happy to oblige, James replied. Margaret can drive the wagon out with the order. My old bones don't take kindly to bumpy roads these days. Matthew's face brightened. That would be perfect if Miss Daniels doesn't mind. Margaret's hands stilled on the cake. Of course not, Mr. Keller. Excellent. Matthew smiled, and Margaret couldn't help noticing how it transformed his already handsome face. The men will be mighty grateful, myself especially. After settling the details and purchasing 2 apple pastries instead of his usual one, Matthew bid them farewell. As the door closed behind him, James turned to his daughter with a curious expression. That's the 3rd time this month young Keller has come in specifically requesting your apple pastries, he observed. And now he wants a special delivery to the ranch. Margaret shrugged, returning her attention to the cake. The Keller ranch has a lot of hungry cowboys, Pa. James stroked his beard. I've been baking in this town for 15 years, and I've never known a Keller to make special requests like this. Not until recently. What are you suggesting? Margaret asked, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. I'm not suggesting anything, daughter. Just making an observation. But there was a gleam in her father's eye that made Margaret wonder. That evening, after closing the bakery, Margaret sat at her small vanity and studied her reflection. Her cheeks were round and pink, her figure substantial beneath her simple nightgown. She had never been slender, even as a child, and after her mother's death 5 years ago, she'd found solace in the very baked goods she helped her father create. You have your mother's beautiful eyes, her father had always told her. But would a man like Matthew Keller see past her size to notice her eyes? Or was she foolishly reading too much into a simple business transaction? She sighed, picking up her hairbrush. Tomorrow she would deliver baked goods to the Keller ranch, and that was all there was to it. Dawn broke crisp and clear the next morning. Margaret and her father had been up since well before sunrise, baking extra loaves of bread, trays of cinnamon rolls, and several dozen cookies. By the time they finished loading the wagon, the sun was casting long shadows down Ordway's Main Street. Now remember, James said as he helped Margaret onto the wagon seat, the Kellers have already paid in advance, but don't let them convince you to leave extra without proper payment. Yes, Pa, Margaret replied, adjusting her bonnet to shield her face from the sun. I should be back by mid-afternoon. The journey to the Keller ranch took nearly an hour, the wagon bumping along the rutted dirt road that led out of town and into the rolling grasslands. As she approached the ranch, Margaret couldn't help but be impressed. The Keller spread was one of the most prosperous in the county, with a large main house, several outbuildings, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and acres of grazing land stretching as far as the eye could see. As she pulled the wagon up to the hitching post near the main house, she noticed several cowboys pausing in their work to watch her arrival. Self-consciousness washed over her as she set the brake and gathered her courage to climb down. Miss Daniels. Matthew's voice called out as he emerged from the barn. He crossed the yard with long strides, reaching the wagon just as she was preparing to descend. Here, let me help you. Before she could protest, he reached up, his strong hands encircling her waist, and lifted her down as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. The ease with which he handled her size, which had always been a source of embarrassment, left her momentarily speechless. Thank you, Mr. Keller, she finally managed, smoothing her skirts to hide her discomfort. Matthew, please, he said, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. We've known each other since school days, after all. It was true. They had attended the same small schoolhouse in Ordway, though Matthew was 3 years her senior and had never paid her much mind back then. Not that she blamed him, the gangly, awkward boy had grown into a man who turned heads throughout the county. Very well. Matthew, she conceded, I've brought everything your father ordered. Shall I help you unload? You'll do no such thing, he insisted. I'll get some of the boys to help. You must be parched after your drive. Come into the house for some tea first. Before she could decline, Matthew was calling out to 2 nearby ranch hands. Jones, Miller, come unload this wagon, and handle those baskets with care if you want to eat what's inside. The men hurried over, tipping their hats respectfully to Margaret before beginning to unload the wagon. This way, Miss Daniels, Matthew said, gesturing toward the main house. My father will want to thank you personally for the delivery. The Keller house was impressive, 2 stories of solid construction with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Inside, it was comfortably furnished, speaking of wealth without ostentation. Matthew led her to a sitting room where an older man with the same wheat-colored hair, now liberally streaked with gray, rose to greet her. Miss Daniels, Edgar Keller said, taking her hand. A pleasure to see you again. Thank you for making the journey out to our humble ranch. Margaret smiled at his courtesy. There was nothing humble about the Keller ranch, and they both knew it. It was no trouble, Mr. Keller. I hope the baked goods meet with your approval. I have no doubt they will. Your father's reputation is well deserved. He gestured to a comfortable armchair. Please sit. My housekeeper will bring refreshments. As they waited, Edgar inquired about her father's health and business. The conversation flowed easily, with Matthew occasionally joining in, his eyes never straying far from Margaret. She found herself relaxing despite her initial nervousness. When the housekeeper arrived with tea and a plate of the very cookies Margaret had baked that morning, Edgar excused himself, citing ranch business that needed his attention. Matthew will see to your comfort, Miss Daniels, he said with a smile that reminded her very much of his son's. Don't rush off too quickly. The journey back to town will be hot at midday. Left alone with Matthew, Margaret suddenly found herself at a loss for words. She sipped her tea, acutely aware of his gaze. I'm glad you came yourself, he finally said, breaking the silence. I was hoping you would. Margaret nearly choked on her tea. You were? Yes. He leaned forward in his chair. I've been trying to find a way to speak with you privately for some time now, without the whole town watching and gossiping. Her heartbeat quickened. What could you possibly have to say to me that requires such privacy, Mr. Keller? Matthew? I've been meaning to ask if you would accompany me to the Harvest Festival next Saturday, he said, a hint of nervousness creeping into his voice. As my guest. Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. The Harvest Festival was the biggest social event in Ordway each fall. Couples attended together, often announcing engagements or intentions to court. You want me to attend the festival with you? She asked slowly. Why? The bluntness of her question seemed to surprise him. Why wouldn't I? You're intelligent, kind, and... He hesitated, a flush creeping up his neck. I find your company very agreeable. Margaret set her teacup down carefully. Matthew, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not naive. Women like me don't receive invitations from men like you unless there's some joke or wager involved. His expression hardened. Is that what you think of me? That I'd be cruel enough to toy with someone's feelings for a laugh? I don't know what to think, she admitted. We've hardly spoken more than pleasantries in all the years we've known each other. Now suddenly, you're buying pastries 3 times a week, arranging deliveries to your ranch, and inviting me to the Harvest Festival. Matthew rose from his chair and moved to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. The gesture was so unexpected that Margaret couldn't find the will to pull away. I've been watching you for longer than you realize, Margaret Daniels, he said softly. I admire your kindness to the children who come to your father's bakery, the way you care for him since your mother's passing, your quiet strength. And yes, I find you beautiful, your eyes, your smile, the way your cheeks flush when you're flustered like now. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her this way before. People will talk, she whispered. People always talk, he replied with a shrug. I don't give a damn what they say. The question is, will you accompany me to the festival? Looking into his earnest blue eyes, Margaret found herself nodding. Yes, she said, surprised at her own courage. I would be honored. His smile was radiant as he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The honor is mine, Miss Daniels. The drive back to Ordway seemed to pass in a blur as Margaret replayed their conversation over and over in her mind. By the time she reached the bakery, she still wasn't entirely convinced that the whole encounter hadn't been some elaborate daydream. How did it go? Her father asked as he helped her down from the wagon. Did they like our goods? Yes, they were very appreciative, Margaret replied, hoping her face didn't betray the tumult of emotions she was feeling. Mr. Keller the Younger asked me to accompany him to the Harvest Festival next weekend. James Daniels' eyebrows shot up. Did he now? And what did you say? I accepted, Margaret said, unable to keep a small smile from her lips. Her father studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. He's a good man, Matthew Keller. Works hard, treats people fairly. His father raised him right after his mother passed. Pa, Margaret said hesitantly, do you think he's sincere? A man like him could have any woman in the county. James took his daughter's hands in his own weathered ones. Maggie, my girl, you've never seen yourself clearly. You have your mother's beauty and her kind heart. Any man would be fortunate to have your affection. If young Keller has finally realized that, then he's smarter than I gave him credit for. The week leading up to the Harvest Festival passed both too quickly and too slowly for Margaret's taste. Word of her impending attendance with Matthew Keller spread through Ordway like wildfire, and she found herself the subject of curious glances and whispered conversations whenever she ventured into town. Some reactions were kind misses. Thompson from the millinery shop stopped by the bakery specifically to tell Margaret how pleased she was to hear the news, and even offered a special discount on a new bonnet for the occasion. Others were less gracious. Margaret overheard Beatrice Wilson telling another woman at the general store that Matthew must have lost a bet to be escorting that Daniels girl to the festival. It's like watching a bull elk court a milk cow, Beatrice had said with a nasty laugh that echoed in Margaret's ears long after she'd fled the store, purchases forgotten. Despite these moments of doubt, Margaret found herself looking forward to the festival with growing excitement. She used some of her savings to purchase a length of deep blue fabric that complemented her eyes, and spent her evenings sewing it into a new dress, more fashionable and flattering than anything she'd worn before. The morning of the festival arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp and clear, with golden sunlight filtering through the changing leaves. Margaret spent extra time with her hair, arranging it in a becoming style she'd seen in a magazine from Denver, and even dabbed a tiny bit of her mother's precious perfume behind her ears. When she descended the stairs to the bakery's living quarters, her father's eyes misted over. "You look just like your mother on the day I first courted her," he said softly. "Beautiful, Maggie." A knock at the door announced Matthew's arrival. Margaret's heart fluttered as her father went to answer it. She heard their voices, her father's gentle warnings about having his daughter home at a reasonable hour, Matthew's respectful assurances before Matthew stepped into view. He was handsomely dressed in a new shirt and vest, his usually unruly hair tamed, hat in hand. When he saw Margaret, he stopped mid-sentence, eyes widening. "Miss Daniels," he finally said, his voice slightly hoarse, "you are a vision." Margaret blushed under his appreciative gaze. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." Matthew offered his arm, and with a final reassurance to her father, they set off toward the town square where the festival was being held. Margaret was acutely aware of the stares and whispers as they walked down the street, but Matthew seemed oblivious, chatting easily about ranch business and asking her opinion on the fall colors. The town square had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from trees, tables were laden with food from every household, and a platform had been erected for the musicians. Colorful bunting and autumn leaves decorated every available surface. As they approached, conversation faltered and heads turned. Margaret felt her courage wavering under the collective gaze of nearly everyone in Ordway. Matthew must have sensed her discomfort, because he placed his hand over hers where it rested on his arm and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Ignore them," he murmured close to her ear. "Their opinions don't matter. Not tonight." With his steady presence beside her, Margaret found herself enjoying the festival despite the occasional whisper or stare. Matthew was attentive, bringing her cider and plates of food, introducing her to ranch hands and business associates as if he were genuinely proud to have her on his arm. "May I have this dance?" he asked, as the musicians struck up a lively tune. Margaret hesitated. "I'm not much of a dancer," she admitted. The truth was, she'd rarely been asked to dance at social gatherings. "Neither am I," Matthew said with a wink. "We can stumble through it together." And stumble they did, laughing as they navigated the steps. Margaret was aware of her size, afraid she would appear awkward or ungainly. But Matthew led with confidence, his hand warm and steady at her waist, making her feel almost graceful. As the evening progressed, and the lanterns cast a golden glow over the festivities, Margaret found herself relaxing into the joy of the moment. When the musicians shifted to a slower, more romantic melody, Matthew drew her closer. "I've been waiting all evening to hold you like this," he confessed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "People are watching," she whispered, though she made no move to increase the distance between them. "Let them watch," he replied. "Maybe they'll learn something about what really matters in life." As they swayed to the music, Margaret allowed herself to hope that perhaps Matthew truly did see something in her that others had overlooked. That perhaps his interest wasn't some fleeting curiosity or worse, a cruel joke. The evening ended too soon. As they walked back to the bakery, Matthew's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing naturally. "I had a wonderful time tonight," Margaret said as they reached her door. "As did I," Matthew replied, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "So wonderful that I hope you'll agree to accompany me to church tomorrow, and perhaps a picnic afterward, if the weather holds." Margaret's heart soared at the invitation. A public escort to church was a clear statement of intentions in a small town like Ordway. "I would like that very much," she said. Matthew's smile could have outshone the stars. He raised her hand to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on her knuckles. "Until tomorrow, then, Miss Daniels." "Until tomorrow," she echoed, reluctantly slipping her hand from his and entering the bakery, where she knew her father would be waiting up to hear about her evening. True to his word, Matthew arrived the next morning to escort Margaret and her father to the small white church at the edge of town. The curious glances and whispers from the night before had multiplied tenfold, but Margaret found she minded them less with Matthew's steady presence beside her. After the service, several of the town's more prominent citizens approached them, including Mayor Williams and his wife. While the mayor engaged Matthew in conversation about cattle prices, Mrs. Williams took the opportunity to pull Margaret aside. "My dear," she said, her pinched expression belying her sugary tone, "you must be quite pleased with yourself. Matthew Keller is considered quite a catch in Ordway." "He's a kind man," Margaret replied cautiously. "Indeed." Mrs. Williams lowered her voice. "Which is why I feel I must speak to you, dear, as a woman of some experience in society." She patted Margaret's arm condescendingly. "Men like the Kellers move in important circles. They require wives who can represent them appropriately. A woman of more delicate proportions, if you understand my meaning." Heat flooded Margaret's face, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "I believe I understand your meaning perfectly, Mrs. Williams." "I'm only thinking of your feelings, dear," the older woman continued. "These attentions from young Keller, they're very flattering, I'm sure, but they can't possibly lead anywhere permanent. It would be best for you to guard your heart." Before Margaret could formulate a response that wouldn't involve words unbecoming of a church setting, Matthew appeared at her side. "Is everything all right, Margaret?" he asked, his eyes moving between her flushed face and Mrs. Williams' artificial smile. "Perfectly fine, Mr. Keller, Mrs. Williams answered before Margaret could speak. I was just offering some friendly advice to Miss Daniels. Women's matters, you understand. I see. Matthew's tone cooled noticeably. If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Williams, I believe Margaret's father is waiting to join us for our picnic. He placed a protective hand at the small of Margaret's back, guiding her away from the mayor's wife. Once they were out of earshot, he bent his head close to hers. What did she say to upset you? Margaret swallowed hard. Nothing I haven't heard before in one form or another. Matthew's jaw tightened. Was it about us? About you being with me, in a manner of speaking, Margaret admitted, not wanting to repeat the humiliating words. She thinks I'm not suitable for someone like you. Matthew's eyes darkened. Because of your size, he said flatly. It wasn't a question. Matthew, perhaps she has a point, Margaret said, the doubts that had been nagging at her since his invitation surfacing fully. You could have any woman in town. Someone like Victoria Evans, who's pretty and graceful and has the personality of a fence post, Matthew interrupted. Margaret, do you think I care what busybodies like Meredith Williams think? Or what anyone thinks? You should care, Margaret insisted, her voice dropping to a whisper as they approached her father. You have a position in this community, a future. The wrong wife would be anyone but the woman I choose, Matthew said firmly. And I've made my choice clear. Unless. His confident expression faltered. Unless you don't share my feelings. The vulnerability in his eyes tugged at Margaret's heart. That's not it at all, she assured him. I just don't want you to regret. The only thing I would regret, he said, taking her hands in his, heedless of the curious onlookers, is letting the opinions of small-minded people keep me from pursuing the woman who has captured my heart. Margaret searched his face for any sign of insincerity but found only earnest affection. Slowly, she nodded. Then I suppose we should join my father for our picnic. Matthew's smile returned, lighting his features. I couldn't agree more. The picnic spot Matthew had chosen was a secluded clearing near the creek that ran just outside of town. The afternoon passed pleasantly, with James Daniels regaling them with stories of his early days in Colorado territory, long before Ordway had been established. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, James made a show of checking his pocket watch. Would you look at the time? He said, gathering his things. I promised Reverend Parker I'd discuss the repair work needed on the church roof. You two enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Matthew, I trust you'll see my daughter home safely before dark. You have my word, sir, Matthew replied. As James disappeared down the path toward town, Margaret shot Matthew a suspicious glance. Did you arrange that? Matthew tried to look innocent but failed miserably. I might have mentioned to your father that I'd appreciate some time alone with you. And he agreed? Margaret asked, surprised. Her father had always been protective. After extracting several promises regarding my intentions and behavior, yes. Matthew's expression grew more serious as he moved to sit beside her on the blanket. Margaret, there's something I need to tell you. Her heart sank. Here it came the explanation that while he enjoyed her company, he couldn't seriously court someone of her size. That Mrs. Williams had been right after all. I've been planning to speak with you for months, he continued, oblivious to her spiraling thoughts. But I could never find the right moment, the right words. When my father decided to place that large order with your bakery, I saw my opportunity. Your father's order was your idea? Margaret asked, surprised. Matthew nodded, a sheepish smile playing at his lips. He was skeptical at first. Cookies biscuits aren't that bad, but he agreed to help once I explained my situation. Your situation, my feelings for you, he clarified. Margaret, I've admired you from afar for years. Your kindness, your quiet strength, the way you care for others without expecting anything in return. But I was young and foolish, too concerned with what others might think. And now, Margaret asked, hardly daring to hope. Now I know what matters. Matthew took her hands in his. I love you, Margaret Daniels. I want to court you properly with your father's blessing, which I've already sought and received. And if you'll have me, someday I want to make you my wife. Margaret's heart felt as if it might burst from her chest. But the talk, the whispers, will die down eventually, he said with confidence. "And if they don't, we'll build our life somewhere they can't reach us. The ranch is far enough from town that we needn't subject ourselves to wagging tongues if we don't wish to." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "Do you really mean that? You would marry me despite what everyone says?" "Because of what everyone says," Matthew corrected her. "Every whisper, every cruel remark has only shown me the strength of your character. You face their judgment with grace and dignity. How could I not fall in love with such a woman?" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment." In his palm lay a delicate silver ring set with a small but perfect sapphire. "It was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to me after she passed, said I should give it to the woman who captured my heart as completely as my mother had captured his." Margaret's breath caught. "Matthew, I'm not asking for an answer today," he hurried to say. "Only your permission to court you properly. To show you and everyone else exactly how serious my intentions are." Through her tears, Margaret smiled. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I would like that very much." Matthew's answering smile was radiant as he carefully slipped the ring back into his pocket. "Then may I seal our understanding with a kiss, Miss Daniels?" Margaret nodded, her heart racing as Matthew leaned closer. His lips met hers gently, almost reverently, in a kiss that promised both tenderness and passion. When they finally parted, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Matthew courted Margaret openly and with obvious devotion. He escorted her to church each Sunday, brought flowers to the bakery, and invited her to dine with him and his father at the ranch on several occasions. The town's reaction was mixed. Some, like the Thompsons and the Parkers, accepted the couple with genuine warmth. Others, including the mayor's wife and her circle, continued to whisper behind their hands whenever Margaret and Matthew appeared together. "Have you heard?" Beatrice Wilson asked loudly one day as Margaret entered the general store. "The Keller boy has actually proposed to the baker's daughter. Can you imagine? He'll need a larger doorway just to get her into the house." The titters that followed the cruel remark cut deep, but Margaret held her head high, completing her shopping with as much dignity as she could muster. When she left the store, she was surprised to find Victoria Evans waiting outside. "Miss Daniels," Victoria said, falling into step beside her. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Margaret regarded the slender blonde warily. Victoria had been one of Matthew's most ardent admirers before he began courting Margaret. "Of course, Miss Evans." "I wanted to apologize," Victoria said, her voice low. "For Beatrice's remarks and for my own behavior. I haven't been kind to you and I regret that." Surprised, Margaret stopped walking. "That's very gracious of you," Victoria sighed, twisting her gloved hands. "The truth is, I always thought Matthew Keller would court me. When he chose you instead, I was hurt and frankly confused." She looked up, meeting Margaret's gaze directly. "But I've seen the way he looks at you, Miss Daniels. He never looked at me that way or anyone else for that matter. He truly loves you." "Thank you for saying so," Margaret replied, deeply touched by the unexpected admission. "Be happy together," Victoria said, offering a small smile before continuing on her way. The encounter left Margaret thoughtful. If even Victoria Evans could see past her own disappointment to recognize the genuine affection between her and Matthew, perhaps others would eventually follow suit. Matthew proposed formally on Christmas Eve, kneeling before her in her father's parlor, the ring that had been his mother's gleaming in the candlelight. Margaret accepted through tears of joy, and they shared the news with her beaming father and Matthew's equally delighted father over a celebratory dinner. They set the wedding date for April, when the spring weather would make travel easier for Matthew's relatives from Denver, and the ranch work would be less demanding. As the date approached, the town's gossip reached a fever pitch. Beatrice Wilson and her cohort made no secret of their prediction that Matthew would come to his senses before the wedding day dawned. "Mark my words," Beatrice told anyone who would listen. "No man wants a wife who outweighs him. He'll cry off and she'll be humiliated. It's for the best, really." Their venom couldn't dim Margaret's happiness, however. With Matthew's encouragement, she had commissioned a wedding dress from the finest dressmaker in Denver, who had traveled to Ordway for fittings. The dress, a creation of ivory satin with delicate lace overlays, made the most of Margaret's womanly curves while downplaying her fuller figure. "You'll be the most beautiful bride Ordway has ever seen," Matthew declared when she mentioned the dress, though tradition dictated he couldn't see it until their wedding day. 2 days before the wedding, disaster struck. A late spring storm blew in from the mountains, bringing heavy rain that swelled the creek to dangerous levels. The bridge connecting the Keller ranch to town was washed out, stranding Matthew on the ranch side. Margaret received the news with growing panic. But how will he get to the wedding? She asked her father as they watched the rain lashing against the bakery windows. "The men will find a way," James assured her. Matthew Keller wouldn't let a little flood keep him from his bride. Sure enough, the next morning brought a mud-splattered messenger from the ranch. "Mr. Keller says not to worry, Miss Daniels," the young ranch hand reported. "He says even if he has to swim the creek, he'll be here to marry you tomorrow." The storm passed overnight, leaving a brilliant blue sky in its wake, but the damage to the bridge remained. As Margaret prepared for her wedding with the help of Mrs. Thompson and several other ladies from church, she tried to quell her anxiety. "He'll be here," Mrs. Thompson said confidently as she arranged Margaret's hair. "That young man would move heaven and earth for you." The simple ceremony was to take place at the church at noon, followed by a celebration at the town hall. As 11 o'clock approached with no sign of Matthew, Margaret's nerves frayed further. She paced the small room at the back of the church where she had dressed in her wedding finery. "Pa, what if something's happened?" she asked when her father came to check on her. "What if he tried to cross the creek and now, Maggie," James said soothingly, "Matthew is too smart for that. He'll find a safe way." At 11:30, a commotion outside drew them to the window. Margaret gasped at the sight. Matthew, dressed in his wedding suit but splattered with mud to his knees, was riding toward the church on his stallion. Behind him came his father and at least a dozen ranch hands, all similarly attired in their Sunday best, despite the evidence of a difficult journey. "He came," Margaret whispered, tears threatening to ruin the careful application of powder on her cheeks. "Did you doubt it?" Her father asked gently. By noon, the church was filled to capacity. It seemed the entire town had turned out, whether to witness the culmination of a genuine romance, or, in some cases, to see if Beatrice Wilson's predictions would come true. As the organ began to play and Margaret prepared to walk down the aisle on her father's arm, she caught a glimpse of Beatrice and several others from her circle, whispering behind their hands. For a moment, doubt assailed her. What if they were right? What if Matthew took one look at her in her wedding finery and realized he'd made a terrible mistake? But when the doors opened and she saw Matthew waiting for her at the altar, his face transformed with love and awe. All doubts fled. She walked toward him with growing confidence, her father's arm steady beneath her hand. "You are breathtaking," Matthew whispered as her father placed her hand in his. The ceremony passed in a blur of emotion. Before she knew it, the Reverend was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Matthew was kissing her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. As they turned to face the congregation, now officially Mr. and Mrs. Matthew Keller, Margaret was aware of the mixed reactions. Most faces reflected genuine happiness for the couple, but a few, including Beatrice Wilson and Meredith Williams, wore expressions of disbelief and thinly veiled disapproval. The celebration at the town hall was a joyous affair, with plenty of food, music, and dancing. Matthew never left Margaret's side, his pride in his new wife evident in every glance, every touch, every whispered endearment. As they prepared to depart for the ranch, which would be their home, Matthew pulled Margaret aside. "Are you ready, Mrs. Keller?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief and love. "Ready for what?" she asked, curious about his expression. "For your grand exit," he replied mysteriously. I've been planning it for weeks." Before she could question him further, he led her back to the center of the hall and called for everyone's attention. "Friends, family, neighbors," he began, his voice carrying across the now quiet room. "I want to thank you all for sharing in our joy today. Now, as tradition dictates, I'll be taking my bride home, but I want to make something clear to everyone here." He turned to look directly at Beatrice Wilson and her group, who had been whispering together in a corner. "I've heard the talk. The speculation about why a man like me would choose a woman like Margaret. Some of you seem to think her size should disqualify her from love, from marriage, from happiness." A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Margaret felt her cheeks burning, but Matthew squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You're right about one thing," he continued. "Margaret is exceptional in every way, including her generous heart, which is bigger and more loving than most people in this room could comprehend. I am the fortunate one in this match, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of her love." With that, he swept Margaret into his arms as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. "And yes, I can carry my wife over the threshold as every good husband should," he declared. "And I'd carry her to the ends of the earth if she asked it of me." A cheer went up from most of the guests as Matthew strode toward the door, Margaret nestled securely in his strong arms. As they passed Beatrice Wilson, whose face had turned an unflattering shade of red, Matthew paused. "Mrs. Wilson," he said pleasantly, "I believe you owe my wife an apology. Several, in fact, but we won't hold our breath waiting for them. We'll be too busy being happily married." With that parting shot, he carried Margaret outside to where a buggy decorated with flowers and ribbons awaited them. The crowd followed, throwing rice and calling good wishes as Matthew carefully settled Margaret in the seat before climbing up beside her. "I hope you're not angry," he said as they drove away, the sounds of celebration fading behind them. "I know it was impulsive, but I couldn't bear another minute of their whispers and judgment." Margaret shook her head, tears of happiness spilling down her cheeks. "Not angry. Never angry with you, Matthew Keller. That was the most gallant, wonderful thing anyone has ever done for me." Matthew smiled, lifting her hand to his lips. "Get used to it, Mrs. Keller. I intend to spend the rest of my life showing you and anyone else who needs convincing exactly how much I adore you, exactly as you are." The journey to the ranch took longer than usual, as they had to detour around the damaged bridge, but Margaret barely noticed. Every moment with Matthew by her side felt like a dream come true, a precious gift she had never dared hope for. As they approached the ranch house, now her home, Matthew reined in the horses. "Almost there, Mrs. Keller. Are you ready for your new life?" "More than ready," she assured him, her heart full to bursting with love. True to his word, when they reached the house, Matthew lifted her from the buggy and carried her across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in the entrance hall that had been decorated with flowers and candles for their arrival. "Welcome home, my love," he whispered before claiming her lips in a kiss that promised a lifetime of passion and devotion. 1 year later, Margaret stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Matthew rode in from checking the fences. Her hand rested protectively on her swollen belly, their first child due to arrive within the month. The past year had been the happiest of her life. Living on the ranch, away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of Ordway, Margaret had blossomed. She had taken over management of the household with a natural efficiency that impressed her father-in-law, and had even started a small side business supplying baked goods to neighboring ranches. More importantly, her relationship with Matthew had deepened and strengthened with each passing day. His love and admiration had never wavered, and Margaret had grown more confident in herself and her place in his life. "How are my two favorite people today?" Matthew called as he dismounted and strode toward the porch. "We're fine," Margaret replied, smiling as he climbed the steps to join her. "Your son has been particularly active this afternoon." "Son, is it?" Matthew chuckled, placing a gentle hand on her belly. "Are you so certain it's not a daughter?" "Mother's intuition," Margaret said confidently. "He'll be tall and strong like his father." Matthew pulled her close, his hand still resting protectively over their unborn child. "As long as he or she has your heart, I'll be the happiest man in Colorado territory." As they stood together, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the whispers and cruel remarks she had endured, to the unexpected love of a man who saw her true worth, to the joy of creating a family together, it had all led to a happiness more profound than she had ever imagined possible. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Keller," Matthew murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was just thinking how fortunate I am," Margaret replied, leaning into his embrace. "To have found a man who doesn't just accept me as I am, but loves me because of it." "No," Matthew said, turning her gently to face him. "I'm the fortunate one. And I intend to spend the rest of our lives making sure you never forget it." As his lips met hers in a tender kiss, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home, her heart, her happily ever after in the arms of a cowboy who had seen her true beauty when everyone else had been blind. A few weeks later, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named James Edgar Keller, after both grandfathers. The birth was difficult, but with Matthew's constant support and the assistance of the local midwife, both mother and child emerged from the ordeal safely. Word of the birth spread quickly, and to Margaret's surprise, many of the town's residents made the journey to the ranch to offer congratulations and gifts for the new baby. Even more surprising was the presence of Beatrice Wilson among the visitors. "Mrs. Keller," Beatrice said stiffly, hovering awkwardly at Margaret's bedside where she was nursing little James. "I've brought a blanket for the baby. I made it myself." "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," Margaret replied, genuinely touched by the unexpected gesture. "It's beautiful workmanship." Beatrice twisted her hands nervously. "I also wanted to say, that is, I may have been hasty in my judgments regarding your marriage. It was as close to an apology as Margaret was likely to get from the proud woman." "Water under the bridge, Mrs. Wilson," she said graciously. "We're all entitled to be wrong occasionally." A ghost of a smile flitted across Beatrice's face. "Indeed we are. Your son is beautiful, Mrs. Keller. He has his father's eyes." After Beatrice departed, Matthew entered the bedroom, having shown the visitor out. "Did I just witness a miracle?" he asked, settling beside Margaret on the bed and stroking their son's downy head. Beatrice Wilson admitting she was wrong. "Not in so many words," Margaret laughed softly, "but close enough. People can surprise you, it seems." "You've surprised me from the moment I truly saw you," Matthew confessed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "And you continue to amaze me every day with your strength, your grace, your boundless capacity for love." Margaret leaned into his embrace, their son nestled securely between them. "We make a good team, Mr. Keller." "The best, Mrs. Keller," he agreed. "The very best." As years passed, the Keller family grew and thrived. James was joined by a sister, Emma, 2 years later, and eventually by another brother, Samuel. The ranch prospered under Matthew's management, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the state as Colorado transitioned from territory to statehood. Margaret never lost her fuller figure, even after 3 children, but it ceased to be a source of shame or self-consciousness. Matthew's love and appreciation for her body never wavered, and his passionate attentions left no doubt of his continued desire for his wife. Their love story became something of a legend in Ordway. Young women swooned over the tale of the handsome rancher who had defied convention and gossip to marry the woman who had captured his heart, regardless of her size. Young men were reminded that true beauty ran deeper than appearance, and that a woman of character and kindness was worth fighting for. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children now grown with families of their own beginning arranged a celebration at the ranch. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered to honor the couple whose love had stood the test of time. During the festivities, James, their eldest, raised a toast. "To my parents, whose love story taught me what to look for in a wife of my own. Papa, You showed me that a real man recognizes true beauty and doesn't let anyone else's opinion sway his heart. Mama, you taught me that confidence comes from being loved for exactly who you are. Margaret, her hair now streaked with silver but her eyes still bright with happiness, leaned against Matthew's shoulder as applause filled the room. Did you ever imagine, all those years ago, that we would end up here? She asked softly. Matthew, still handsome despite the lines that time had etched around his eyes and mouth, smiled down at her. From the moment I carried you over that threshold, I knew we were building something special. Something that would last. Even when I was struggling to lose the baby weight after Samuel, she teased, recalling her frustration when the pounds had proven particularly stubborn after their third child. Especially then, Matthew replied, his voice husky with emotion. You were bringing our children into the world, nurturing them with the same generous love you've always shown me. How could I not adore every inch of you? Later that evening, after the guests had departed, and their children had retired to their rooms or returned to their own homes nearby, Matthew and Margaret stood on the porch of the ranch house, much as they had done countless evenings over the years. 25 years, Margaret marveled, looking out over the land that had been the backdrop to their life together. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you carried me into this house. I'd do it again in a heartbeat, Matthew said, slipping his arm around her waist and pulling her close. At our age, Margaret laughed, you'd throw your back out. Is that a challenge, Mrs. Keller? Matthew's eyes sparkled with the same mischief that had first captured her heart. Before she could protest, he had swept her into his arms, still strong despite the passing years. Matthew. She gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his neck. Put me down before you hurt yourself. Never, he declared, carrying her through the door and into the house with the same easy strength he had demonstrated on their wedding day. I told you I'd carry you to the ends of the earth if you asked, and I meant it. As he set her gently on her feet in the entrance hall, now worn smooth by the passage of children and grandchildren, Matthew cupped her face in his hands. I love you, Margaret Keller. Every day with you has been a gift beyond measure. And I love you, she replied, her heart as full as it had been on the day they wed. Thank you for truly seeing me when no one else did. Their lips met in a kiss that held all the passion of youth, tempered by the deep, abiding love that only years of shared joys and sorrows could create. And in that moment, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that the whispers and cruel remarks of long ago had been the prelude to the greatest blessing of her life, the love of a man who had never cared what others thought, who had proposed anyway, and who had carried her not just over the threshold, but through a lifetime of love.